Thank you so much, Rebecca, and for everyone in the UK Radon Association for inviting me. So yes, I am going to speak about change. We're going through a period of history with a great deal of change, and I'm going to speak about how radon is changing for many of us and throughout the world. And so, yeah, my talk today really is going to focus on sort of a global flavor as well as change. So I'm here, in case you didn't know where the University of Calgary is. Forgive you for not doing so, but I'm in the Charbonneau Cancer Institute. We really do have a focus on all sorts of cancers and their prevalence and their prevention. And one of the things we have to keep in our mind is, depending on where we are in the world, the #1 cause of cancer is different, and that depends upon the exposures in these parts of the world. Where I am, it's lung cancer, but that's not necessarily the same across the planet. But because lung cancer is one of the leading causes of cancer death, it is, irrespective of where you are in the world, incredibly important to look at. Here in Canada, we're faced with, realistically, a lung cancer crisis, where the number of deaths we get from lung cancer outstrip the combined cause deaths from colorectal cancer, breast cancer, and prostate cancer together. Cases are the #1 cause of cancer, and as I say, it's the leading cause of cancer death. What many don't realize is that of all of these cases of lung cancer, fully 1 in 5, 20%, occur in people who have never picked up a cigarette in their entire life. This amounts to just over 5,000 Canadians a year, or to put it another way, 110,000 just since the dawn of the 21st century. For a nation like Canada, which has about the population of London, that's an awful lot of people to be losing their lives having never picked up a cigarette in their entire life. Now, of course, we know the causes of lung cancer in people who do not smoke. I don't need to tell this audience that radon gas amongst those is one of the leading causes. It's the second leading cause of all lung cancers, the leading cause in never smokers. Before I get much further, I just wanted to put my biology hat on and remind everybody here of why we are so terrible at, our bodies are so terrible at reacting to the exposure to radon gas. Now, we have to remember that radon, of course, is a radioactive element. It emits particle radiation. Alpha particles, helium ions that move at 15,000 kilometers per second with enough energy to dent bulletproof plastic. We all know that's how alpha track radon detectors work. Well, those same alpha particles are bulldozing into our DNA, causing mutations. If we compare particle radiation to photon radiation, which you're probably more familiar with in the form of, say, an X-ray or a gamma ray, they're very different. The photon moves through us incredibly quickly, doesn't deposit much energy. That it does deposit isn't particularly mutagenic, meaning it doesn't cause a lot of genetic mutations that would drive cancer. Particles, on the other hand, are very mutagenic because they deposit a lot of energy in a short space. We can visualize this. I'm going to show you a quick movie. Now, the cell, the two cells here, the DNA is sort of labeled in green. And when you see a green dot, that represents a breakage in the DNA. The cell on the left is going to be exposed to X-rays, and the cell on the right is going to be exposed to particles. You're going to see a quite different pattern where the one on the left, which is exposed to X-rays, has lots of individualized dots, where the one on the right has a single track, illustrating this sort of cartoon I just showed you. There's an enormous difference in the way our bodies react to these types of DNA damage and our ability to repair them without error. The ones caused by particles almost never are repaired without error. And of course, that's a problem. And in fact, if you look per dose at the ability of particles, i.e. radon, versus photons to cause cancer in mammals, there is no difference. Particles are far, far more cancer causing per dose relative to the other radiation types. When I speak about this to the general public, I often use the analogy: if you consider a photon a single bullet that I shoot at the side of a building, that building is going to be fine. But particles is the equivalent of a 580 square meter carpet bombing of the building. The building is not fine, our cells are not fine, our DNA is not fine, and indeed radon is extremely carcinogenic. Well, why so? Why are we so good at dealing with photon damage and not particles? Well, we've looked at this. One of the main reasons, using new technology we developed last year in our ability to deliver low doses of particle radiation, just like you would get in a household filled with radon, low doses over a long period, repetitive exposure, we can see that our bodies are just fundamentally less able to repair it. If you look over the course of a day, so 24 hours, the amount of damage induced by, say, an X-ray is very quickly repaired. Almost all of it's gone 12 hours later. No harm, no foul. But particles in green here, they're not gone within a day. And in fact, they will persist for days and days and days and weeks. And as they slowly disappear, what's left behind is not correctly repaired DNA, it's mutated DNA. And that's fundamentally why this is so dangerous for us. And I'll remind everybody, we never evolved to deal with particle radiation. The modern paradigm has it that radon is emitting all the time from, you know, our front gardens in a field all across the earth, where it dilutes almost to nothing very, very quickly within a short distance of where it comes out of the surface of the earth. But however, in the 20th and 21st century, we have built buildings that have captured, contained, and concentrated radon to levels that, although we've seen radiation throughout our evolution in the form of, say, photons, X-rays, gamma rays, we have not experienced radon levels at the concentrations we are seeing now. Hence, we have never evolved the need to cope with this type of radiation damage. Had we evolved in space, we might have, because there's a lot more particle radiation in space. So with that, I'm going to flip to some of the stories that we've been producing over the past couple of years on the changing epidemiology of radon exposure. Everybody these days is a bit of an amateur epidemiologist. We're used to looking at these type of things with respect to COVID numbers, but what does it look like for radon exposure and cancer risk? And so I'm going to go through some of what we've been doing in that respect. Again, probably don't need to tell this audience to have a radon problem. You need three ingredients: the geologic source, the built environment that contains and concentrates the radon from the geologic source, and then people within that built environment whose behavior or demographics place them in harm's way. In order to understand this, we employ something basically with the overarching term of exposure science, or exposomics, where you measure, assess risk, see patterns, build solutions, and make an impact with the knowledge you've gained by doing everything else. In Canada, as Rebecca kindly pointed out, the study we've been doing is called Evict Radon. And it is a citizen scientist-based study. So knowing that gathering large quantities of high-quality radon data is a Herculean task, especially when you're coupling to research, we reached out to the Canadian general public, and we found a very large, successful, and robust appetite for public radon testing, where they can consent to give over their results, as well as a lot of details about themselves and their houses, to us as cancer researchers, so we can understand it. This all has the oversight of our local research ethics boards. In fact, these are national research ethics boards, using, in Canada, CNRPP certified alpha track radon testing kits. And our goal, of course, is to understand and ultimately find ways to engineer out radon from the, in our case, the Canadian built environment. Just by way of disclosures, I have nothing to declare, and no member of the team directly profits or indirectly from radon testing or mitigation. The project has multiple goals. You can read about this on our website at evictradon.org, but just quickly, obviously we want to find ways to protect people from the harmful effects of radon gas, understand why not every type of house or building or office or school necessarily has a radon problem, engineer it out from our properties, aspects of consumer protection. So what's a good radon test, what's a not good radon test in terms of reliability and value, early detection of radon-induced lung cancer, which is a big part of what we do in our biology, and then understanding the psychology, the behavioral science of radon testing, awareness, and mitigation. And so this all starts, of course, with us capturing radon data. We're sitting at just under, in fact, it's over now. This is about 6 months out of date, but we have about 30,000 and counting radon outcomes from across Canada. What we find is that approximately 1 in 5 exceed 200 becquerels, and more than 50% exceed 100 becquerels. a fairly substantial radon issue with levels in the 30,000s of becquerels, and these are all long-term 90 or more day outcomes. So if you look across our nation from coast to coast, north and south, it is a landscape of particularly high radon exposure. Where I am in the prairies, there's a question there, evictradon.org is what you need to look for. There'll be a link throughout my presentation, just keep an eye out for that URL. Where again, we see particularly high levels. These are geometric means. The average for Canada is 85 becquerels, with, in my particular neighborhoods, an average of 100. So an average where you start to see a statistically significant increase in lifetime risk of lung cancer from radon. And we found no areas that are low. Comparing them to the global statistics, we find that the different regions of Canada occupy the second, the third, the fourth, the seventh, and the 16th highest residential radon levels compared to all other countries that we were able to get long-term high-quality alpha track radon data from. Britain is a little bit further down those rankings, but Canada particularly has a profound radon problem, and I'll get into why shortly. One of the things we found in Canada, at least, is that the old paradigm of radon, particularly being higher in winter, but not necessarily summer, is no longer true. Taking our many tens of thousands of radon outcomes, where we do actually have radon tests 90 days conducted throughout the summer months, say June, July, August, statistically speaking, there is no significant difference in the outcomes of radon across any season we look at in Canada, compared to either any other 90-day test or sometimes a 365 full year test, which we do have some. Again, they're all around 100 becquerels, no significant difference. We've done a lot of real-time radon testing. We've got more than, some houses we've tested for 5 years in a row. And we're plotting this in what I'm calling a polar plot here. So you would read this plot like you might read a clock, right? Start off at 12 o'clock, otherwise known as January, and go clockwise around the year. And the little dots there, you can see they represent the radon level in a single house across the year, captured every single hour. What you can see here is the traditional paradigm of radon being higher in the colder months, so September to April in our case in Canada, and lower in the summer months. But we only see this 25% of the time now in Canada. In fact, a lot of the time, 25%, we actually see higher radon in summer, warmer months compared to the winter months. This house had particularly high radon in the middle of July and far lower in February. Then there's the remaining 50%, which are more or less consistent across the entire year. What we have is this particular house, it was going up, it was going down, and there was no particularly notable trend. The point is, our seasonal differences in Canada are no longer there. We've been translating a lot of these into radiation doses, so the doses to the lungs. I'll just remind everybody that the becquerel, which we're used to thinking about for radon, equates to the number of radioactive events per second. So if you're sitting under the radioactive tree, the number of apples falling from the tree, that's the becquerel, that's the number of particles per second per cubic meter of air. For medicine and biology, of course, we translate that into units of absorbed energy. So the gray is the absorbed energy, the joules per kilo of person. And we translate that into the sievert, and that's the ones that have a biological effect. In the case of particle radiation from radon, typically 1 gray is 1 sievert. So what are the doses that we're actually seeing in terms of particle radiation to the lungs? We're using ICRP, the International Commission for Radiological Protection, latest formula to do that. I recognize there are different formulas for doing that. I'm just telling you what we're using right now. Without going through the details of the math here, I'm just showing you the formula we use. As long as you know the amount of time a person is spending in a given environment, we've captured that through EvictRadon. Every single one of our participants tell us exactly how long per day they're spending in their house versus their office, away from work, if they spend time away from work or whatever. And we're able to take that information, multiplex it with their actual radon level, their long-term outcomes, and derive, using that data, their actual exposures. And so we actually can calculate the radiation to their lungs from just their residential radon in millisieverts per year. And what we're seeing is that the average of Canadian is 3 times more than what has been defined as the global average. with some people receiving up to 23 millisieverts a week to the lungs. These are extraordinary doses of radiation. As a radiobiologist, I saw this and just about fell off my chair, far in excess of what a maximum limit would be for nuclear energy work over a 5-year period. We're talking levels of radiation in Canada that people get from their houses that you might not even see until you went up to the International Space Station. Fairly profound. And so unsurprisingly, just in my neck of the woods in Alberta, our population health experts have calculated that 15.7% of all lung cancers are due to radon, and that equates to basically 377 a year, or put another way, 1 every 23 hours. That's pretty profound for a population with only 4 million people. So we have a big problem. This, of course, is a high burden on our healthcare system, motivated to do something about it. So how do we do that? Well, we have to understand the built environment within which the high radon levels we're experiencing arises. And so what we do know, though, is that our built environment is changing, not just ours, but it's also changing across the world. And more recently, we've been looking at that across 2 regions. As probably, again, everybody is aware, our built environment can concentrate or potentially dilute our exposures to a whole variety of things. In the case of radon, it very much concentrates it, and that becomes a problem. So we do a lot of measuring of properties through our study, all sorts of different aspects of that. One of the sort of more simple ones we found is that the type of house you live in matters how much radon statistically you would be exposed to. In Canada, the bungalow is king as far as high radon is concerned, with 1 in 4 of them exceed 200 becquerels per cubic meter. If you are, however, in a row-style house, particularly if you're in the middle of the row, it's much less. It's 1 in 10, still pretty high, but a lot less than that bungalow, with some of the other types of properties you can see there sort of falling into the middle. So that's what's just the generalized type of house. But what else have we found? Well, we've looked at lots of different metrics. You're seeing some of the ones here in this little thing, like just the decade of construction, building type, square footage of the basement, or the main floor, how old are the windows, triple glaze, double glaze, single glaze, all of these things. I don't have time to go through all of them today, but those are the survivors. Those are the ones that actually matter, and it can tell us, using prediction models, the likelihood of a house exceeding 100 or 500 becquerels. We're getting a lot closer using machine learning algorithms, artificial intelligence, of just inputting the features of a Canadian house, and it then outputting the relative risk of that property. One of the most significant features we found is the decade that property was built. And what we observed from that is in Canada, the newer your house, the higher your radon levels are likely to be. Just after World War II, it was approximately 1 in 9 houses exceeded 200 becquerels. Today, they exceed 200 becquerels if they were built in the 1940s to 50s. But if your house was built in Canada in the past 20 years, it's now 1 in 4.5. And in fact, if it was built in the past 5 years, it's actually 1 in 3.5. So it's still getting worse. It's getting worse and worse and worse over time. And so one of the things we did more recently is we looked across the ocean to Sweden. Our colleagues there at Radonova were very kind and collaborated with us on a study that has just come out. We'll be publicizing it shortly. And what we did was we compared residential radon levels between Canada and Sweden, two relatively cold climate countries, unscathed by war, with relatively healthy, educated populations and comparable general infrastructures. There's a size difference. Canada is much larger, but generally speaking, there's a lot more in common than we have different. So we took forward our substantial body of radon test outcomes. You can see the raw data here. So we had just under 40,000 Swedish and just over 25,000 Canadian unmitigated detached or semi-detached or row houses built since 1945. GM stands for geometric mean here. AM stands for arithmetic mean. So you can see the levels. Are between the 60s up and the hundreds. They're all long-term tests, and they were all conducted between in the 21st century, so between 2004 and today, depending on where. In the case of the Swedish ones, before you ask, we excluded all of the blue concrete containing properties from that, because there were no blue concrete containing properties in Canada. We never incorporated that, and we excluded them from the Swedish ones. If you look at our paper, you can see what happened to those. We did report on them. But if you look at the sort of general patterns of the blue and the red dots here, where blue is Canada and red is, sorry, blue is Sweden and red is Canada, you might pick out a pattern. Well, I'm going to make it a little bit easier for you because we took the geometric means over time based upon the decade that property was built. And what you can see is quite striking. Around the 1950s, Sweden had much higher radon than Canada. It was exceeded 100 becquerels per cubic meter. Canada's was around 75. Around the 1980s, we met. Canada and Sweden, properties built around the 1980s were built with more or less the same radon at approximately 100 becquerels, both problematic. But since the 1980s, you can see what happened in Sweden is the polar opposite to what unfortunately happened in Canada, where Sweden systematically engineered out the majority of their high radon, which is not to say there aren't properties with high radon in Sweden. There absolutely are. If you look at the breadth of the built environment compared to the Canadian one, what you see today is a 467% difference between the two nations, where Canadian new residential properties have far, far higher radon compared to the Canadian equivalents. So the question is why? The first thing we did is we looked at, well, is it all types of houses? And so this is single-family detached houses. Yep, same trend. Side-by-side duplex houses. Yep, more or less the same trend. Even row houses, more or less the same trend. A little bit lower, of course, in the case of the Canadian, but still went up as the Swedish went down. So it was more or less independent of the property type. And we noticed in our data, if we looked a lot more closely, there were two periods of particular interest. In Sweden, it was the mid to late 1970s. That marked a period of substantial change where their radon started to go down and then kept going down. In Canada, it was the mid to late 2000s, where around 2005, it started to go up and it kept going up and has not gone down since. Now, in both periods, those coincided with a new building code where certain things were introduced. What were they? Well, in both cases, energy efficiency measures were introduced in that period, as well as things like heat recovery ventilation, but completely opposite outcomes. Well, of course, it was natural for us to look at that. So we looked at 4 different ventilation types. I'm showing you there at the top what they are: natural ventilation, mechanical exhaust in supply, or what's now very common in both countries for new house, mechanical exhaust in supply with heat recovery ventilation. I'm showing you a cartoon here of what heat recovery ventilation is. Basically, it's a way for your house to sort of recover a proportion of the heat that it's put into the air as it exchanges fresh for stale. As it exchanges stale for fresh air. So what happened if we look at the data as a function of the exact ventilation type? Well, unfortunately, it didn't really tell us much because irrespective of the ventilation type, they all went down in Sweden and they all went up in Canada. So this is important though, because it excludes the ventilation type as being per se the major causative reason for high radon in Canada or low radon in Sweden. Singularly, it's not this variable. Of course, this was tied a lot with energy efficiency measures. It's really important, particularly in Canada, for us to say this, because a lot of people are, certain sectors are naysayers against energy efficiency for whatever reason, and say, oh, they use one reason. Oh, you can't put energy efficiency in, it'll make high radon. Well, we say, no, you can look at what the Swedish have done. They've done it. These are very energy efficient houses, yet they have low radon. There's not a direct relationship in terms of causation if you interpret it that way. We think it is much more about the heating types between the two nations. If you look at the primary heating systems and type of energy used in Canada, we're overwhelmingly using forced air furnace. These are natural gas furnaces. In some cases, about 10% we use radiators. That's very common in Britain, I know. And then we use some electric baseboards and radiant heating. Again, the air dynamics of a property where you're using forced air ventilation or heating stoves or radiators is quite different from what is now the norm in Scandinavia, particularly Sweden, which is district heating. It represents the overwhelming majority of how properties are heated in Sweden. And in that case, you have a centralized heating plant. It's often using biofuel or whatever, and that distributes across a large area heated water with cold return to distribute. If you don't have a little furnace power plant in every single house circulating air, and the way that they do it, we think you're going to produce a very different environment, which could be why certain energy efficiency measures in Canada are modifying and could be contributing to high radon, which is not the opposite case in Sweden. So anyway, I can answer more questions on that later. One of the things we did do, and this is published in our papers, we are applying our machine learning techniques, our artificial intelligence approaches, learning so many details about the different types of houses based on all their metrics and their radon, and the machines are learning. And in fact, what we did is we asked the AI to perform hundreds and hundreds of simulations projecting forward the next 30 years, so up to 2050, based upon the last 30 years of data that we have collected across both countries. And what the artificial intelligence told us is that, assuming there's no active intervention, and we did this on purpose because we wanted to show what no intervention would look like in our build codes, Canadian radon is going to increase another 25%, while Swedish radon is likely going to decrease a little bit further down. But Swedish radon is already quite low as a generalized whole. That's less of a return compared to what it already is now, which is very low. So this builds a very strong case for doing something extra in the Canadian built environment, and it illustrates how much things have changed for us simply since the end of World War II. We're not mincing words here in Canada. We say we have a crisis ahead. You know, it's already bad. It's going to get worse unless we do something. Our next build code is due to come out in 2025. We do have time to get more robust radon mitigation measures in there. Everything that was done in the 2010 build code has done zero, nothing whatsoever. We measured before and after that radon levels. They didn't change at all. In fact, in some cases, they went up. I can talk more about what measures those were. Again, at the end of the day, they didn't do anything. So new measures are needed here in Canada. So in the latter chapter of my talk here, I'm going to try and end in the next 15 minutes, so we have time for lots of questions. We looked at human behavior, right? Spoke about the built environment and the sources of radon. But what about the human behavior? That's really changing a lot right now. And of course, modifying our radon exposure and our lung cancer risk. Populations matter. Your age matters. Your gender matters. How many children you may or may not have matters. What your job is matters. And so we've looked at a lot of these features to determine points of intervention that we can exploit. For the good. So one of the big ones that we looked at and published earlier this year was age and how many children you might have. And what we found was unfortunately, a worst case scenario where the highest radon, which we encounter, as I told you, in the newest houses, are home to the youngest Canadians with the most children. So in here in red, you're seeing the age of the primary homeowner, and it was almost a decade younger than the average age of someone in a house built in the 1990s, who typically at that age, all their children have already grown up and left. The ones, I'm showing you the children data, but that'll be, you can find all these publications on our website, and I'll show you them at the end. If you are living in a house built in the past 5 years in Canada, you're most likely to be somewhere in your 30s to 40s. You're most likely having young children, and you are more than twice as likely as a woman to be pregnant. And so this is a big problem because, right, the younger you are when you're exposed to radon, the greater your lifetime risk, because you have that much more life left within which to develop a lung cancer from exposure at a younger age. So that was one example, age there. So why? And this is particularly true. So we have to first consider the regional differences between Canada and Europe, North America really, and Europe, and the way we've evolved our cities. In Europe, there's this sort of paradigm of the suburbs containing a lot more high rises, and the inner city being a little bit less high-rise buildings, where in North America, there's that stereotype, and it doesn't always apply, but it is a general trend. In fact, you're seeing a picture here of my city, Calgary, where you can see an incredibly centralized office tower region downtown, and these oceans of suburbs surrounding them. This is just the way North American cities have evolved, and that makes a difference, right? These cities tend to be nucleated and grow outwards. The oldest buildings are in the middle, and the newest buildings are on the outskirts. This is a map of the city center of the city of Calgary, our different areas, the average home price and the income needed to purchase there, a residential property. So if you're in the city center, the oldest part of Calgary, you need an income of over 100,000 in order to afford a house there. However, if you're on the newer outskirts, you need a lot less of an income. Well, of course, age makes a huge difference to your income, and so does radon, unfortunately. The older houses have less radon, the newer houses have more radon. The younger people can't afford to be in the old neighborhoods, they have to be on the outskirts. They're exposed to the most radon for that reason. And it's not just even within the city. You can go at a sort of blast radius. You know, this is a paradigm that, you know, if you compare the commuter difference, it's cheaper to live further away from downtown. You know, when I used to live in Britain, of course, you know, if you're young, you can't afford to live necessarily in the heart of London as buying a house, right? But you can commute for maybe 3 hours away. So it's just similar to what we encounter here. The further you move away, the newer the properties in our case, but also the higher the radon for the younger people in them. So that creates this sort of bias within the way people access our residential property environment that unfortunately makes younger people more exposed to radon. So what are some other factors? So one of the things we've looked at is the perceptions of radon awareness and the time that one takes from first being made aware of radon. So, you know, for example, any one of us going out, have a conversation for the very first time with someone who'd never heard of radon before, you tell them about it. How many more encounters with information do they need before they get a test and deploy that test? Or how long is the period within which that happens? We've actually tested that, we measured that. So what we found was quite striking. So here you can see the number of times people had to either hear or read about radon relative to the very first time before getting a radon test. Full 20%, so 1/5, they only needed to hear about it once. They got a radon test. But a 15% had to hear about it more than 6 times, sometimes more than 10 times before they did anything. We also looked at the exact same data, but as a function of how long each group took. So here you can see that here. So the darker the blue, the longer they took. And if you look at the people who only took one encounter with information, the vast majority of them are getting a radon test in only a few weeks. You know, what you can see there is 80% are getting it in less than a month. But if you look at the people who took more than 10 encounters with radon awareness information to get a test, well, they're taking more than 4 years to get a test in those cases. This is the slow to act population. And what do this population look like relative to the quick to act population? There are differences. So I'm going to take you through 2 of the key ones. There are many more than just I'm showing. I'm taking through the key ones. Well, the first one is your gender. Like many health-seeking behaviors, men do themselves no favors whatsoever where it comes to getting a radon test. Women are far more likely to be quick to act from becoming aware to getting a test than men, and you can see that's very statistically significant there. We in cancer prevention, we see this in fact all the time. This is a bit of a joke, but this is a real billboard that was actually in the United States. Thousands of years, men will die from stubbornness. We just do not want to go to the doctor. And someone spray painted on that, no, we won't. And that illustrates the stubbornness that many men do have with respect to health-seeking behavior. And radon is clearly no exception to that rule. Women are far more likely to be the people who make the decision to get a test from fewer encounters with information in a faster period of time. And that makes a difference. If you're getting that radon test, which turns out to be incredibly high in only a week, versus you're getting that test that turns out to be really high after 4 years, that's 4 more years of potentially high DNA damaging lung cancer causing radiation exposure. That makes a difference to your lifetime risk. And it's entirely dependent on your psychology, and in this case, your gender. What else? Well, the other big one we found was your profession mattered. What were you trained in? What are you doing? And so we assessed whether people self-identified as working or qualified in these professions. So you see, we grouped geology, chemistry, and physics together, sort of hard sciences, medicine, health or life sciences together, real estate, engineering or architecture, so, knowledge of buildings, public health or industrial hygiene. That would include a radon testing professional or other professions that weren't aligned with those which we felt might have had privileged or at least some specialist knowledge about what radon it might be from a variety of different perspectives. And what we found was that those who were slow to act, the slowest to act groups, were overrepresented for those in the hard sciences, engineering or architecture, or real estate. And why is the case? Right? It was very statistically significant. Why are they much slower to act? And this overrode gender effects. Both men and women in these professions were equally likely to be slower to act on radon awareness information compared to their colleagues, friends, and neighbors who were either in medicine, health, life sciences, public health, or just none of the above. Maybe they worked in retail, maybe they were a librarian. Why were the chemists, the physicists, the geologists, the architects, the real estate professionals, and the engineers far slower to act? Well, first, this illustrates the fact that existing radon awareness programs, techniques, and information, which is generally one size fits all, isn't suited. We need to speak differently to people based upon their professional educational background in this case, to convince them perhaps to be act faster. My clinical psychology colleagues explained that the most likely reason for these differences is cognitive dissonance. And so this is a situation we're illustrating here in this little cartoon, the inconvenient truth versus the reassuring lie. And you get a lot more people showing up for the reassuring lie than they want for the inconvenient truth. And it could be as simple as this. The cognition one, radon exposure is unhealthy. Okay, yeah, I've been told that. But the false belief, I'm going to say specifically false. So say you're a real estate professional, you're selling houses. You might falsely believe, because you just haven't got that information in your head yet, or you never encountered it, that your job is actually making the radon exposure problem worse. I'm selling houses with high radon, but I'm a good person. It's inconvenient for me to think that I'm bad because I'm doing this, even if it might be incorrect. Therefore, I'm downplaying the risks of radon exposure, and I take far longer to get a radon test as a consequence. Cognitive dissonance. And so, there are ways and tricks you can get around that. Use very different approaches to convince people across different professions in order to get that. And of course, the other one is men in general. The grumpy old man as a stereotype, actually, as far as health-seeking behavior is concerned, is true. And of course, then the flip side of that is let's target women a lot better, or even more than we're already doing, because they are the more amenable change makers. If a woman is the decision maker about who's getting a radon test in the household, you're far more likely to convince them to get one faster and with less bother than you are if you're dealing with a male decision maker in that household. So we're working, of course, on that. So finally, in my last 5 minutes, of course, it would be remiss in 2021 if we didn't talk about the pandemic. Rebecca hinted some needs around that. Well, I'm going to go a little bit further. So how is the pandemic modifying our radon exposure? Well, telecommuting, working from home, something we're probably all doing right now, was already on the rise. If you look at data from the United States, this is the Seattle area from 2007 to 2017, it had already more or less increased by 50% in that time. People like this. If it suits their specific type of job. Remember, Seattle's a very high-tech area, but it was happening there. We've assessed radon exposures, radiation doses to the lungs for those who report working away at an office versus telecommuting or being retired. And there's a massive statistically significant increase of about 7 millisieverts per year to the lungs in the case of the working from home group versus those who were working away at hours. So these are pre-pandemic numbers. So it's already this kind of difference. Well, of course, as we know, most of us have pivoted that. And what we're seeing right now is something that you may not have encountered, but it's a lot in the news these days, something called the Great Resignation. Everybody is going through a sort of occupational crisis right now. Well, not everybody, but a large number of people. And they're making the choice. Do you want to continue working in that office environment on the left, which you might not have enjoyed, but I bet was much lower in radon compared to your house, which is not subject to the same occupational health and safety rules and could have higher radon? So people are making these choices right now based upon the past 2 years where it wasn't necessarily a choice through the lockdown cycles. We've been monitoring this in Canada through the UK Radon study, and we already have data. So this is data from 2020, what happened pre and post March, which is when the pandemic hit Canada of that year. And what you can see here is on the sort of y-axis, you can see particle radiation to the lungs from radon in houses during the pandemic. So this is March to November of 2020, compared to the rate of exposure the year before the pandemic. For almost everybody, it went up. Not for everybody, but if it was going to change, it statistically went up. In some cases, it went down. Think about our poor healthcare professionals. My sister, she's an MD. She spent a lot more time at the hospital than she did before the pandemic for obvious reasons. But most of us didn't do that. It didn't change respective of your gender, so this happened to men and women equally, but it absolutely mattered whether you were working or not. If you were already retired, although you did see a change because you perhaps weren't going out to the the shops as much, or to the movies, or to whatever, it made a bigger difference if you were working. You saw a much bigger change, and your age mattered significantly. So if you were young, between 18 to 45 years of age, you experienced the biggest change, a 20% jump in your annual radiation exposure to the lungs from residential radon gas, simply due to the lockdown cycles and telecommuting. Well, now, what's going to happen as we move forward? We're already seeing a tsunami of disability coming. 1 in 5 patients who are hospitalized with COVID leave with a permanent long-term disability. This is because COVID, if you're hospitalized from it, is causing injury, permanent injury to your lungs and or your heart. Chronic fatigue, inability to climb stairs, you tire easily, cognitive problems, all of which are impinging upon their ability to work. They are classified as long-term disabled. We have to prepare for a future. This was an article in Scientific American not that long ago, July of this year. They said we have to prepare for a million, where millions of survivors are chronically ill, disabled. And we've looked at that. This is pre-pandemic. We already knew that the disabled, who are already a marginalized population, were more likely to be exposed to radon, almost double compared to the able-bodied working in terms of their annual radiation exposure, just because of the nature of their lives experiencing disability. And so now, where we have this massive surge in people who have survived COVID, but been injured by it and now are experiencing disability, they are going to be exposed to more radon, statistically speaking. Well, it's not just as simple as that. If you look at the paradigm of lung cancer risk, these are the 6 big things. How old you are, your personal history of lung cancer, occupational chemicals, arsenic, for example. Of course, if you're exposed to secondhand smoke, radon. But here's the other big elephant in the room: a past history of lung disease. We already knew that if you had suffered from pneumonia or tuberculosis, your fundamental risk of lung cancer from another exposure like radon was statistically incredibly higher compared to people who have never experienced a lung disease like this. There's every reason to suspect that the massive number of COVID survivors we're seeing across the world with permanent lung damage from this are going to be very similar. This is the study that showed the link between lung cancer risk and tuberculosis or pneumonia or emphysema is going to be a lot higher. And so those with lung damage are going to represent a much bigger population of people fundamentally susceptible to the negative health consequences of radon exposure. So we have a double whammy scenario in the 21st century, and this is how it's really changing. This is where I'm going to close. Lung cancer risk, it's the hazard multiplied by the vulnerability. So the hazard, what's that? The likelihood of being exposed. The dose, of course, is how much is in your house if you're likely to be exposed, multiplied by your innate susceptibility. Genetics is one thing, fine, but now we have a surge in lung injury, and then the modifiers. So, your diet, your fitness, and your general behavior. In the 21st century, your likelihood depends more or less on where you are in the world. For example, I showed you in Sweden, it's gone down over time, where in Canada, it has gone up. If you're likely to be exposed, what are the levels? Well, in Canada, we also know it's gone up. And due to the pandemic and more telecommuting, it is also going up. So hazards have gone up. But also, we know that lung injury is going up. So it's a double multiplying scenario of lung cancer risk, and we have to intervene now in order to prevent this future. So these are some of the papers we've been putting out. You'll find them all over vicradon.org on our publications page. They're free for download. And at this point, I'm happy to take any questions from the audience. If someone wants to read them out to me.
Sure. Thank you so much, Aaron, for that. That was absolutely brilliant, fascinating, so much good information in there that I'm sure we're all going to go away and digest and yeah, look back at. So we have got quite a few questions. I'll try and get through as many as I can now before we have a break. But then, yeah, we'll get answers to people otherwise. And
I'll stick around at the coffee break if people want to just type.
Super. Thank you so much. Okay, so I will start with one here that's coming from Andrew Stoter that says, offices are still part of the built environment. So what is the reason why spending work time in an office versus your home is so significantly different?
So, well, I mean, it's different across most of the world, but again, occupational health and safety rules across the office environment have meant that a far greater proportion of that built environment has been mitigated for radon, or fundamentally was lower for radon compared to the residential built environment. And that's the simple reason that I think we see such a big difference in exposure between the two.
Okay, we've got some talks coming up after the break about radon in the workplace in the UK, so we'll see whether the feeling...
I'll qualify that by saying it does depend on your workplace.
Yeah.
If you happen to work in, say, a fish farm or a brewery in Canada, you're going to be much more highly exposed to radon. Of course, if you're a miner, it's obvious. If you're an office worker, it may be a bit different.
Okay. Interesting. Next one here that says, please can you discuss the requirements of radon mitigation design in new build properties in Canada and any subsequent testing that's required in the first year of occupation. So I guess that's what was in the 2010 building codes that hasn't made things worse.
So the only thing that was put into the 2010 build code was a radon rough-in. So this is the subslab depressurization rough-in portal. A small, typically useless vapor barrier and washed gravel underneath to make a future mitigation easier. We assayed before and after. So the decade after the build code and the decade before the build code, exactly the same type of houses. And there was no difference. In fact, it went up afterwards a little bit. So there's some nuanced details about why that is. For example, a radon rough-in looks like a future bathtub or toilet plumbing fixture. So people unwittingly remove the cap, which you've now just created a plume of radon in your basement of your house, and they don't put it back and they don't seal it properly. That's created an issue that was unintended. Vapor barriers get walked across with steel-toed boots by the construction workers. They're almost rendered immediately useless. One of the things we did is there are no rules about having to test within 1 year of property construction. And we actually found in our paper that in both Sweden and Canada, if you test for radon in the first 2 to 3 years after the foundation has been poured, you're underestimating radon by 21%. It was remarkably consistent between both countries because the concrete foundation continues to cure. As it cures, it shrinks a little bit and more radon will penetrate up into the property. That was very consistent. So what we're recommending now is that if you are radon testing within the first 1 to 2 years, you actually need to multiply the reading you're getting, increasing that by 20% to get a really good picture of what it will likely be over the long term.
Wow. Well, we've got another talk later on about verification of new build and yeah, what we're doing at the moment to try and ensure that the protection we put in new builds over here works. But yeah, whether we're going to see a similar case is yet to be seen. Okay, another question here that says, can you explain a bit more about the mechanism for forced air furnace heating increasing the radon levels?
Okay, so forced air ventilation, which is not something that all the years I lived in England I ever saw, but you almost never do not see it here. 94% of houses built across the Canadian prairies have forced air ventilation. What that basically is a natural gas heating unit in the lowest level of the house. It's typically the basement that superheats the fresh air from the outside intake, and then using a blower motor, distributes it through all the upper floors of the property. What we see in that case is a massive distribution of air from the lowest levels to all other levels. We basically see hardly any difference between basement radon and upper floor radon. It's only a 13% difference in average levels between before. We published that in our 2018 paper. And of course, it becomes a giant radon distribution device if you have a problem. Now, worst case scenario, you actually have a foundational penetration with negative pressures being generated every time the furnace turns on. It generates a negative pressure in the basement. The house can't bring enough fresh air to make up the difference. And so what it does instead is it sucks on the ground. And we can actually see cases with such enormously high negative pressures in the lowest levels that it becomes a radon mining device, distributing radon through the whole property. That's a big problem in the North American built environment.
Wow. So do you think the revision of the building codes is going to address that and bring in?
Well, no, not really, because there's no
heating system.
The Canadian government or the North American system eliminating natural gas furnaces in any quick period of time. So I get asked this, what's the magic wand? Well, the magic wand is a full install of a subslab depressurization device in every new build. We can't afford to wait 40 years like happened in Sweden to eliminate our systematic radon problem. And so, so I think that's what's actively being looked at now, either the installation of a full passive or full active mitigation system in every new build, because the risks are just so high.
Thank you. Next question here is saying that the World Health Organization seems to be slightly modifying the language they're using regarding how they're ranking lung cancer causes, and saying that maybe linking radon as the second leading cause might not be correct, and there might be other potential health factors as well. So do you think this may change how we all need to communicate about radon in the future? And might the level of public perception or trust in the science change if it's then backtracked?
So I'll say that science changes all the time. And just because radon, maybe it's the number 3, it makes it no less significant and no less dangerous. The other major factors that we have to consider are changing dramatically right now are our exposure to combustion particulates, so air pollution. It's a big thing, and heavy metals, right? Titanium dioxide, iron oxide, arsenic is everywhere. Realistically speaking, we are going to be exposed to all of them at once. This is mixed exposure science, very rare, if not impossible, to only be exposed to one of them. We need to understand all of them, and it absolutely, in my view, as a scientist who's looking at this kind of stuff, does not detract from the good work and the important need to reduce radon across the entire built environment. I personally wouldn't worry about it. Will it change our messaging? Yes, we'll have to nuance it a little bit, but I don't think if we get that messaging right, it will invalidate anything that any of us are doing right now.
Okay, thank you. Be interesting to see how it does change. One quick more question here that's come in. How does the risk of lung cancer from radon compare with that of smoking in Canada?
So Canadian smoking rates are more or less the same as Swedish smoking rates right now, 12% plus minus 1. But our lung cancer rates are 163% higher here. So what we're seeing is, the vast majority of the Canadian population, 88% don't smoke, never have. Right? Yet why is our lung cancer rates 163% higher here? Well, the big smoking gun in the room is radon, which is 467% higher here than Sweden. That, of course, is modified by our relative fitness. Canadians are less fit relative to your typical Swede, and they have a poorer diet relative to your typical Swede. These are modifiers, though. I'm going to stress the difference between this. This is what some folks I've seen getting wrong, and we're trying to change that. Trigger and modifier. Just because you have a bad diet or you never move off the settee does not mean you're going to get lung cancer. But if you have a trigger like radon exposure, a poor diet and sedentary behavior, not moving much, will increase your risk from that trigger. So trigger and modifier, and that's an important thing to look at. And smoking is much the same, right? So relatively speaking, of course, yes, 4 and 5 lung cancer patients we ever get, they are smokers, but the 1 in 5 is not. That's a big number from public health. 110,000 Canadians dead just since the year 2001 due to this.
Wow, incredible figures. Yeah, something needs to be done. I've got one more question quickly before we head off for the break. There are a few on here, but one that I wanted to bring up was in your comparison study you did with Sweden and Canada. I saw that your the top levels that you found was, I think, 13,000 becquerels in Sweden and over 32,000 in Canada. Were those households just selected at random and you happened to find houses with those levels and the occupants had no idea.
Correct. Yep. They, from the outside looking in, the house you wouldn't even look at twice. Long-term radon tests conducted in a, in a sensible place in the property. 30,000 becquerels. You know what? It's not even the highest house we've seen. We have short-term data on another house that's not too far away from me. 110,000 becquerels in that house. These are sometimes that particular house was peculiar. It had an old decommissioned well in the property in the basement. That was a weird case. But that other one, the 30,000 house, there's nothing unusual about that house other than the fact it had such incredibly high radon. It's a bit like the Stanley Watrous house back, in the original discovery of high radon in residences back in the 80s. We're seeing these. I mean, his house was particularly unremarkable. So are these. You just find them. And many, many more in the multi-thousands, 1 to 5,000 we see all the time.
Yeah. And what was the reaction of the homeowners when you told them these levels? Were they glad they participated in the study and that they now knew? Or
the reactions very much depend on the behavior and the psychology of the people. So we've seen all sorts. People who have been enormously grateful, fixed it right away. Others that wanted no knowledge of this, shoved it away and are still breathing in 5 to 10,000 becquerels today. We can't stop them. We can make recommendations. It's technically considered now a material latent defect in the property. They can't sell it ethically. They can sell it legally. They can't sell it ethically unless they disclose that. But yes, some of the ones in the most incredibly high houses, we've been very lucky. They've engaged with our project. They've been advocates. And in fact, we were on the front page of Canada's largest newspaper back in May of this year in the Toronto Star, speaking about this and this particular house, which again, relatively unremarkable. Thankfully, that couple had only moved in a few months before. They had the presence of mind to do a radon test. They weren't breathing in 100,000 becquerels for 10 years. It was more like 9 months.
Oh, good. And they've done something about it.
They fixed it. It took a while. It's a complicated house, but it's fixed.
Sounds like it would. Yeah, it would need more than a fix. Excellent. Okay, well, we're gonna leave it there. We have got some more questions. We'll see if Erin can answer them during the coffee break, or we can put them to him via email if necessary. Thank you so much once again, Erin, for joining us. We really appreciate it. So much knowledge, valuable knowledge you've shared with us all today. So thank you very much. We hope you'll see you at a future event. And
I hope so too.
We'll let you get
at 4 in the morning.